The more we love Jesus in the Eucharist, the more we are strengthened by him. I don't know about you, but we need that grace of strength in these days when our time is scattered among lots of different responsibilities, different memberships and different organizations, and perhaps even just family situations. Lots of things seem to contribute to our listlessness at times, our weakness interiorly, our sort of lethargic feeling at times. Not just the weather, it's also something else. But the more we love Jesus in the Eucharist, the more we will be strengthened by him. So it is a matter of us giving him ourselves. He's already giving himself to us without holding anything back. Now today, the solemnity of Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, is the church kind of saying, we want seconds. Because in some ways, we've already celebrated the Eucharist as far as the institution of it at the Last Supper, Holy Thursday. Holy Thursday, we begin that celebration, of course, really focusing on the Eucharist and the priesthood that are intrinsically connected. But here, we celebrated it again because the church is saying we want seconds. You know, when the ice cream is good, you want a second helping. Or for the Italians among us, the gelato. When the gelato is good, we want seconds. When there's a good hill, downhill skiing or something. I mean, that was great at the bottom. You're like, that was awesome. You're going to do it again. You want seconds when it's so good. And then even with like a fishing spot, you know, if this fishing spot is good, you want to go back to it because you know it's good. Now today we do the same thing. We want seconds. The Eucharist is so good. We must come back to it and focus on it for the purpose of deepening our love for the Eucharist, to see and consider his real presence there, veiled in those attributes of body and of wine and bread. It looks like that, but he is truly present. This feast, too, was instituted 700 years ago. And we should ask why these feasts come up and where did they come from? This one came from a Eucharistic miracle. So we look back to the origins. In 1263, a priest who was originally from Germany but stationed in Prague, in the Czech Republic, he was traveling to Italy on pilgrimage to Rome, and he stopped in a little town called Bolsena. And in Bolsena, he celebrated Mass in the basilica there over the tomb of Saint Christina, located in that church. And while he was celebrating Mass, he came to the words of consecration. He had done the epiclesis and he had said, let your spirit come upon these gifts. And then at the words of institution, of consecration, immediately as he concluded them, immediately blood started to seep from the consecrated host and pour over and trickle over his hands and onto the altar. At first the priest tried to hide the blood, but eventually he interrupted Mass completely and asked to be taken to the neighboring city of Orvieto, where Pope Urban IV lived. The Pope was not there, but he sent emissaries to investigate this Eucharistic miracle. The facts were gathered, and he ordered the bishop of the diocese to bring the host and the corporal linen cloth bearing the stains of blood to him. He had them investigated and then truly proclaimed they are true, and he had the relics then placed in the local cathedral. The linen corporal bearing the spots of blood is still there encased in a reliquary and exhibited in the cathedral in Orvieto. Pope Urban IV then was prompted by this miracle to commission St. Thomas Aquinas to compose the Mass prayers and the Liturgy of the Hours to celebrate the Corpus Christi solemnity. And 1 year after the miracle, in August of 1264, Pope Urban IV introduced the solemnity of Corpus Christi. St. John Paul II had visited also Bolsena and Orvieto in 1990 and prayed in front of these relics. Raphael, the famous painter, also beautifully painted the Mass of Bolsena, which is now in the Vatican museums, and you can see it today. The Orvieto Cathedral, where the miracle is preserved, is also one of my stops on the pilgrimage in November. So, as well as the Eucharistic miracle, in Siena. We'll stop there as well. So this is a little shameless advertising for that trip. Yes, indeed. And so we'll stop, of course, in Orvieto at the cathedral there to see these relics, the origins of this particular solemnity. We'll stop in Siena as well, where 223 hosts have been preserved for 280 years without being corrupt at all. They're still fully intact. The local bishop actually had 100 hosts placed in a seal-tight container in a similar in the tabernacle as well that were unconsecrated, and they sat there for 10 years and they took them out and they had rotted. So this is a big deal, in fact. And there's also Eucharistic miracles that we'll try to stop by in Rome and Florence as well. There are 132 Eucharistic miracles worldwide in various countries. Belgium, France has 12. Austria has a number of them as well. And Germany has 9. But then good old Italy has 29 of them. And these things, of course, these Eucharistic miracles, they engage our senses, right? It moves us. We see that there is blood coming from this. And then they test the blood and they find out the blood type and everything. And it engages our senses, right? And so the Lord allows these things to take place. And the church investigates them very carefully before they proclaim them a miracle. But the miracle happens every Mass. The miracle happens through the words of institution, that consecration prayer, the words of Jesus, that they are performative utterances by the very fact of them being said through that particular person with the authority to say them, it happens. Analogously, you can kind of look at an umpire, we've got baseball season now. The umpire, because of who he is and his authority, when he declares somebody's out, by his saying it, it happens. He says it, but it also happens factually because he says it, because of who is saying it. And no matter what manager doesn't like it, The same is very true with the priesthood. As he says those words of Jesus, it happens. Jesus is made truly present in those elements. And it's interesting to look at our own Eucharistic piety then on this particular day, to consider it, As I look back in my personal history, it began with just an object of reverence, because my dad was a deacon, and I also saw priests and knew them to some degree, and we had an Irish priest in our parish, Father Seamus Walsh, and he was like, Anthony, how are you? He was just a lighthearted guy. When it came to the Eucharist, though, he did concentrate. It was reverence. My dad as well. So I saw it as an object of reverence. I was still, as a child, you don't really grasp it fully, but you believe into it. You tend towards it, lean towards it. Then in college seminary, when I was there, we had adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament for 1 hour every day, 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. Yes, college guys had to do that. 6 a.m. came pretty early some mornings. But then, that was during philosophy, and then when I studied theology in Rome, I was also invited to go to the procession in Bolsena and Orvieto, the origins of this feast. They have a big Eucharistic procession in each of the towns on the same day. So it takes all day long to do these processions, and they are some of the most beautiful processions I have ever heard of. They are beautiful. The towns shut down, and then they make rose petals and beans and make mosaics on a pathway through the town. And only the Blessed Sacrament can walk on that particular path. The rest go on the outsides of it and follow the Eucharist through the town. There's big, lunch times. It's a big celebration, too, for these towns. And I was edified by the love of the Eucharist there. It also bolstered my own faith by seeing these processions, and my love of the Eucharist grew and grew. Then, in 2011, I was a deacon for Good Friday services for Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus. And there I was deacon of the Eucharist and retrieved the Eucharist from the Blessed Sacrament Reservation Chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. And as I came out, I saw St. Peter's Basilica in all of its beauty, and all these people from all around the world there for Good Friday services with the Holy Father, dropping to their knees as the Blessed Sacrament passed by them. Jesus was passing by, and they fell to their knees out of love. And it was beautiful. And now as a priest, it is so incredibly awesome, and no one is worthy to celebrate those things except by those who Jesus chooses. And he chooses weak instruments. It's amazing to do his work. Look at the biblical figures. Moses was not immaculate either in his own personal history. Look at the many figures. But he still works through them great things, which gives us all hope, of course. Now, with the Eucharist, the more love we give Jesus in the Eucharist, the more we will be strengthened by him. So let us examine today how we receive him in the Holy Mass, how we receive Jesus in the Eucharist. When we receive him, let us call to our minds and hearts who it is we are receiving, and not to rush that encounter. I know that's a temptation at times because we're in a line, even though we don't need to be in a line, but there's a lot involved with that. But don't be worried about the people behind you. Don't even think about them. You know, like, oh, I better hurry because they'll be behind me and they'll be, it's not like traffic, okay? It's an encounter with Jesus. That's what it is primarily. So concentrate on that as best you can. I know our minds can wander, and that's okay. Jesus is patient with us. But how do we receive him? Again, those two modes, on the tongue, is the primary way of receiving Jesus, on the tongue. Now, why though? Why? Again, we've asked the question, I'm sure, plenty of times, but the consecrated hands of the priest, since he represents Jesus, there is a spiritual fruitfulness in the priest, with his consecrated hands also, feeding the flock of Christ, feeding, and they, being fed by the Good Shepherd, really. And that is what it is. And it's kind of a moment of vulnerability, too, to be open to Jesus and just to receive and not kind of doing it ourselves. It's kind of a different thing. The secondary mode that has been allowed by the U.S. bishops is on the hand. But if we receive on the hand, make sure it is very flat and not slanted. Because if that Eucharist falls to the ground out of neglect, of course, we have to make precautions and we have to really stop everything and make sure we take care of any Eucharistic particles that have fallen to the ground. That is because we love him, not because we're concerned about rubrics or something like that. No, it is animated by love of our Lord. That's the purpose of it all. Anyways, is to show our love for him. He's giving himself, making himself vulnerable, coming down to us, sinful though we are, but in need of him, and he knows that. And he comes to us, he rushes to us. And we must teach our children too, to love Jesus in the Eucharist, to teach them when they ask questions and not just say, well, I don't know, maybe ask Father. Well, let's learn about it ourselves. I'm happy to answer questions. But if we read into it a little bit more, catechisms are online now, very simple. And then teach them. Use the questions as teaching moments. And then we will begin to love him more and more. And we are strengthened by him, by that relationship that we have. The more we love Jesus in the Eucharist, the more we will be strengthened by him.